Trey wants to talk about hell, and we're talking about heaven and earth. We want to talk
Yeah,
about hell, but I
yeah,
think first we should talk about death
sure.
because we have to understand hell with
Fun
relation
Right,
topic.
to
right,
death because
right.
death is
Yeah.
hell is the second death, so Gehenna
Yes.
is the second death. So we should talk a little bit about death.
Right.
Basically, if paradise is where heaven and earth perfectly unite, death is the opposite. It's where there's a failure of heaven and earth to unite, of actuality and potentiality to meet, of form and matter to be brought together. So that's what death is. It's
Yes.
and so it's this corruption, this tendency of form and matter to not
Hmm.
be coterminous, which is like,
Right.
I mean, literally, if the form of me is going to stop informing the matter which composes my body, and that is the
Yeah.
bodily death.
Yeah.
So there's this separation. There's an insufficient union of heaven and earth that characterizes this fallen reality. Now,
Right.
there's a fine line, fine grained distinction to make that David Billinghart makes in his book Beauty of the Infinite, where he talks about, do you have fundamentally an ontology of peace or an ontology of violence? Is this corruption basically, if you look at like Gnostic systems or
Hegel.
basically any kind of just the very laying out of reality entails corruption. Just the fact that form is united to matter is basically a deficiency in form.
Yeah.
It's going to necessarily entail that form is not long for this earth, right?
Hmm.
And the union of form and matter is not long for this earth. Pardon the pun, but yeah. So we want to avoid that. We want to avoid saying that this is just the basically death, the corruption, misery, all the discrepancies between form and matter, between heaven and earth that we experience in our world. We want to avoid saying that's just like kind of the way things are. They just had to be this way,
Yeah.
because then
Yeah.
fundamentally you're falling into this metaphysics of violence that David Bentley talks about in Beauty of the Infinite. We want to
Right.
uphold a metaphysic of peace, an ontology of peace, a fundamental peace, but nonetheless there's this tear in reality that is contingent but nonetheless there between form and
Right.
matter, a kind of tendency to disincarnate, you could say, and ultimately this
Yeah.
is like fully expressed in the second death, hell. So do you want to
Hmm.
talk about that a bit, Trey?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about this. And before we get into the concrete examples, I think we should sort of establish, I mean, you already did like I'm just going to put what you said in a different way of what death fundamentally is. The division of form and matter, we could say, this split, it is an anti-communal movement because the whole point is, Nate just explained this perfectly, is that the whole point is that heavens descend to earth. It's this hierarchical union, which is what we'll talk about after sort of the sin, hell, and death section. But it's a hierarchical union that with sin, it fails. It's the inversion of hierarchy. This is very Pajovian, right? So when we're talking about death, then we should just understand it as the opposite or the fruit, the bad fruit of non-communion, of the failure to commune. Because if life and being in God, they are communion. We've already established this. They are divine energies of God, which we can only have through participation in God. And hell is the severance of participation in God willfully on our side. Um, Given this case, if life and being is communion, then what is death? Well, logically, from our metaphysics, death would be a fall into self relation. Instead of movement towards the other, it's a self reversing movement that paradoxically, even though you're reversing to yourself, you're losing yourself because the truth of yourself is not within, it is the logi of God, which exists from without, right? And that's why to know yourself, to truly become yourself, is to transcend yourself into union with the other who knows you more fully than you are, who has what you are more fully than you possibly can alone. Ontologically speaking, this is just sort of a necessity of the doctrine of creation. And given the doctrine of creation, since we are entirely contingent upon God, who is the source of life, to move away from God is to fall into death, because it is to move into self-isolation. And us in our isolated selves do not have any being. We only have being insofar as we are participating in God. Now, what is the biblical warrant for this definition of death as self-relation? Well, I think the best proof text for this is dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. What is a better image of self relation than just that right there. Adam is dust. He is meant to be heavenized, spiritualized, the dust, just as God originally sent the breath, the spirit into Adam. The spirit is meant to fully indwell Adam, fully spiritualize, deify him, unite heaven and earth in Adam. This is why man is, as Allhart was saying, the unity of heaven and earth. The failure of this, the turning away from the heavens, the turning away from God, is the dust falling back into itself in this self-relating, self-referential movement, which is dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. So this is just another way of saying what Allhart was saying, which is the division of form and matter, of heaven and earth. We're saying fundamentally the same thing here. It's that through law, through in the inversing of this hierarchy, through the lower failing to act receptively, to receive the gift of being faithfully, and then to further glorify this being through responding dialogically, actively to God, actively but secondarily, of course. Instead of doing that, we have the self-reversal movement, self-reversing movement, as Nate talked about in the previous podcast. Adam was meant to receive knowledge of good and evil from God, but instead he seized it for himself. This seizing of something for ourselves, this breaking away from God to try and hoard something for ourselves, the dust trying to turn on its own self and just be dust. Well, that's what God says. You are dust, and you shall be dust. To dust you shall return. Because when you sin, when you withdraw, this is how we understand sin, withdrawing from communion, ultimately with God, that is quite literally the dust turning again away from the spirit, and the spirit is inside of us, giving us life. So that principle, that what Allhart was talking about, of the schism, of literally the form schisming against the matter, that is literally what's happening when the dust returns to itself instead of fulfilling its telos, its natural teleology, which is to be paradoxically, supernaturally brought into union with the infinite.